Magnus Carlsen, the formidable Norwegian chess maestro, boasts a remarkable record as a title magnet, having conquered all major chess tournaments. With an astonishing peak rating of 2882, he resides in a league of his own, making his competitors feel as distant as a faraway constellation. But hold on to your pawns. This time his opponent is none other than the rising Indian sensation, Ramesh Babu Praggnanandhaa, who became a grandmaster when most kids are still trying to master their multiplication tables. The game starts with Praggnanandhaa opting for the king's pawn opening, initiating with e4. Magnus counters with e5, to which Pragg responds by moving his knight to f3, and Magnus mirrors this move with his knight to c6. Pragg further develops by positioning his bishop on c4, prompting Magnus to continue with his knight to f6. Following a few opening moves, Pragg opts to castle his king, prompting Magnus to respond with a5. Pragg then advances his bishop to e3 on the dark squares, proposing a bishop exchange. Magnus promptly accepts the offer, and Pragg recaptures with his pawn, leading to doubled pawns along the e-file. Magnus in response castles his king to safety. Pragg plays his knight to d2. After a couple of moves, Magnus slides his pawn to d5, attacking the bishop. Pragg decides to retreat his bishop. Magnus brings his queen into the game, sliding it to d6. Pragg counters this move by sliding his queen to g3. Magnus launches an attack on Pragg's queen with his knight. Instead of retreating, Pragg slides his queen to g5. This move builds tension on Black's kingside, so to avoid any possible threats, Magnus slides his pawn forward to g6. Pragg realizes that if he wants to win this game, he needs to strike now. Pragg aggressively maneuvers his knight to f5. The idea behind this move is that the pawn is pinned, and Magnus can only capture this knight with his bishop. Magnus instantly goes for this move, and Pragg recaptures with his pawn, building more tension on the g6 pawn. Magnus calmly slides his king to g7, avoiding all the possible threats, and the game is equal at this stage. Pragg relocates his king to the h1 square. After a thoughtful pause, Magnus chooses to propose a queen exchange, moving his queen to f6. Pragg agrees to the trade, and Magnus recaptures with his knight. At this point, Pragg makes the decision to also exchange the pawns. As the game progresses, Magnus launches an attack on the knight using his rook, compelling Pragg to defend it with his own rook. Both players engage in strategic piece maneuvers, seeking more active positions for their forces. Pragg then opts to initiate an attack on the kingside with the pawn move. In response, Magnus counters with his pawn advancing to f6. Pragg proceeds by maneuvering his rook, reinforcing the defense of the g4 pawn. Magnus seizes the opportunity and advances his knight into action. Pragg makes a pawn move, advancing it forward to simultaneously target Magnus's pawn and knight. This forces Magnus to recapture the pawn, to which Pragg responds by recapturing with his rook. After a couple of more moves, Magnus offers a rook trade by sliding his rook to f6. This move left Pragg in deep thought. Trading pieces and entering an endgame against Magnus Carlsen is like challenging a shark to a swimming race. You might as well tape a checkmate me sign to your forehead and hope he's feeling merciful. But hey, speaking of smart moves, if you haven't already considered subscribing to our channel Horsey, it's like adding a powerful piece to your chess army. Think of it as your opening move towards chess greatness. After thinking for a while, Pragg decides to accept this trade. Magnus captures back with his knight. We see a pawn exchange on b4, and both players start maneuvering their kings, bringing them into action. Magnus attacks the rook with his knight, forcing Pragg to move his rook. At this point, Pragg makes a huge blunder. Pragg slides his pawn to a6, which offers a free pawn to Magnus. Magnus captures back with his pawn. Pragg strategically moves his bishop to attack the pawn on c6, but endgame genius Magnus slides his rook to c3, attacking the knight. This move forces Pragg to relocate his knight, but Pragg again makes a mistake. The best move for Pragg is knight to b6, which defends the crucial bishop on a4 square. But Pragg decides to move the knight to a5. Magnus jumps in with his knight, and Pragg slides his rook to c2, offering a rook trade. Instead of trading the rooks, Magnus proceeds with knight to h3, giving a check to Magnus's king and forcing it to move to f1 square. Then Magnus slides his rook to a3, a brilliant move. This move attacks the bishop and knight simultaneously. After a thoughtful pause, Pragg makes a bold move, capturing the pawn on c6 with his knight, boldly delivering a check to Magnus's king. In response, Magnus smoothly shuffles his king to f6, prompting a surprising turn of events that left chess enthusiasts wide-eyed. Pragg resigns immediately, crowning Magnus as champion. Why, you ask? Well, attempting to protect that bishop from Magnus's rook is like trying to hide a cookie from the Cookie Monster. Sometimes, even in chess, You've got to know when to say, checkmate me, if you can.